Minnesota Territory, 1888. January 15. Outside temperature, 32 below zero. A Norwegian carpenter was still cutting vent boards into his cabin floor in midwinter while his neighbors sealed every crack against the cold. They called it madness. They called him a fool for heating the outdoors. He insisted on a 14-foot flue when most used 8. He left a half-inch gap near the floor, open all night. He refused to close his stove damper more than 2/3, even during blizzards. Standard practice was different: chink tight, bank the fire low, trust the iron stove to keep you safe. Then the cold wave hit. 11 days below 20 below. Cabins across 3 counties went silent. Families found dead in their beds, faces relaxed, stoves still warm. No fire damage. No struggle. Coroners listed the same 2 words, stove gas. But that fool's cabin. His family woke every morning. No dizziness. No illness. No death. What did he understand about fire, draft, and invisible poison that everyone else missed? And why did the tool settlers trusted most to survive winter become the thing that killed them quietly in their sleep? If you respect real stories that carry lessons worth passing on, make sure to subscribe. There are more historical accounts ahead. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. The cold came early to Marshall, Minnesota in the winter of 1888, settling over the prairie in mid-November with the kind of stillness that made even experienced homesteaders uneasy. By January, the thermometer had dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time, transforming the landscape into a monochrome study of white earth and gray sky. Smoke rose straight from cabin chimneys in the windless air, then dissipated into nothing. Inside those cabins, cast-iron stoves glowed red at their bases, radiating heat that families gathered around like moths to flame. Nils Bergstrom had arrived in Minnesota Territory from coastal Norway 20 years earlier, carrying with him the kind of practical knowledge that didn't announce itself until it mattered. He was a carpenter by trade, trained in a region where winter darkness lasted months and ventilation failures were already understood by the time his grandfather built houses. When he constructed his own claim shanty in 1873, neighbors watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as he insisted on methods that seemed wasteful at best, dangerous at worst. The cabin itself was unremarkable in size, 14 feet by 16 feet with a 7-foot ceiling, built from rough-sawn pine and chinked with clay and prairie grass like every other homestead shelter within 10 miles. But the details revealed a different philosophy. While most settlers ran their stovepipes horizontally through the nearest wall, then bent them upward for 6 or 8 feet of exterior flue, Nils built his system vertically from the start. The pipe rose straight through the roof, extending 14 feet above the cabin floor, braced against wind with guy wires and kept clear of accumulated creosote through weekly brushing. His neighbors asked why he wasted money on extra pipe sections when shorter flues worked fine. He told them fire needed to draw or it would turn against you, but the explanation satisfied no one. The real controversy came with his insistence on permanent ventilation. Near the cabin floor, Nils had cut a board to leave a half-inch gap that ran the width of one wall, positioned to pull cold air inward without creating a direct draft on sleeping areas. At night, when temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 below, he left this gap open. He also refused to close his stove damper more than 2/3, even during the coldest stretches when every other homesteader sealed their systems tight to conserve heat and wood. The accusations came quickly. He was heating the outdoors. He was burning through firewood that cost $1.50 per cord, money that families could barely spare. He was following old country superstitions that had no place on the American frontier where iron stoves had replaced open hearths and modern efficiency ruled. The skepticism intensified when Thomas Hendricks, a claim shanty owner who served as the local justice of the peace, began weighing in on the matter. Hendricks had witnessed more land claims and coroners' inquests than anyone in the county, and his experience carried weight in settlement disputes. He believed in sealing cabins tight, banking fires low at night, and trusting cast-iron stoves to manage themselves. His own cabin featured careful chinking, a standard 8-foot flue, and a damper that closed completely after the evening fire burned down to coals. When he visited Nils's cabin during a January cold snap and felt the draft from the floor vent, he shook his head. Waste, he called it. Pure waste of hard-earned resources. But Nils had learned something in coastal Norway that the frontier had not yet taught its settlers: fire was not a passive tool that simply burned fuel and produced heat. It was a process that consumed air, transformed it, and expelled what remained. When that process occurred in a sealed space with inadequate draft, the expelled air, what he called spent fire air, had nowhere to go but back into the living space. It was invisible. It was odorless. And it was deadly in concentrations that built slowly over hours while families slept. The physics were simple enough that a child could grasp them, though few adults wanted to listen. A fire needed oxygen to burn completely. When oxygen dropped below a certain level, combustion became incomplete, producing a gas that bonded with blood faster than oxygen itself could. A tall flue created stronger draft through the simple action of hot air rising and pulling fresh air behind it. A 16-foot flue produced roughly twice the draft of an 8-foot flue because the column of hot air had more height to pull against the cold air outside. The floor vent provided makeup air, replacing what the fire consumed and preventing the deadly reversal where smoke rolled back down the flue when the fire banked low. Leaving the damper partially open ensured continuous flow even when flames died to embers. The stove merchants who sold cast-iron heating systems throughout Minnesota and the Dakotas emphasized fuel efficiency in their instructions, not airflow safety. They recommended closing dampers at night to extend burn time and conserve wood. They sold flues in standard 8-foot sections because anything longer required custom ordering and raised costs. Their knowledge came from manufacturers in distant foundries, not from winters spent watching how fire behaved in sealed spaces. When Nils explained his concerns to the regional distributor during a supply run to town, the man blamed user error or cheap fuel. Good stoves, he insisted, didn't produce dangerous fumes if operated correctly. By mid-January of 1888, the temperature had not risen above zero in 11 days. Families burned through a cord and a half of wood per week, stacking split logs beside their stoves and feeding the fire every few hours. At night, they banked the coals, closed the dampers, and sealed themselves into warmth that felt like safety. The cabins grew quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the occasional crack of shifting logs in the firebox. Outside, the stars were sharp and merciless in the clear air. Inside, carbon monoxide concentrations climbed silently past 400 parts per million, then 600, then 800, reaching levels that caused unconsciousness within 2 to 3 hours of exposure. The first deaths were discovered on January 16. A family of 4 found still in their beds, faces relaxed, no signs of struggle. The stove ashes were warm. The cabin showed no fire damage. The coroner listed the cause simply as stove gas, the same phrase that had appeared in similar inquests across the territory for the past 5 winters. By January 20, 3 more cabins had gone silent. All newly built. All tightly chinked. All following the standard practice that everyone insisted worked fine. And in Nils Bergstrom's cabin, with its wasteful floor vent and its fool's refusal to close the damper, his family woke every morning to frost on the windows and breath that came easy. The question that haunted settlement meetings throughout late January was deceptively simple: why did warmth itself become deadly? Thomas Hendricks had presided over 4 inquests in 3 weeks, each one revealing the same pattern. Families found deceased in their beds, stoves still containing warm ash, no evidence of fire escape or structural failure, and cabin interiors that showed careful construction and proper chinking. The phrase stove gas appeared in every official record, but few could explain what the term actually meant beyond a vague association with smoke and suffocation. Nils Bergstrom understood it as a matter of combustion chemistry, though he would never have used those words. In coastal Norway, where winters stretched dark and cold for months, builders had learned through generations of trial and fatal error that fire produced 2 kinds of air. Clean fire air came from complete combustion when oxygen was plentiful and flames burned hot and blue. Spent fire air came from incomplete combustion when oxygen dropped too low and flames turned yellow and lazy, producing an invisible gas that had no smell and gave no warning before it rendered a person unconscious. The difference between the two was not the stove itself but the system around it, the height of the flue, the presence of makeup air, and the refusal to seal the fire away from the atmosphere it needed to burn clean. The mechanics were governed by principles that required no formal education to grasp. Hot air rose because it was lighter than cold air, creating what builders called draft. The taller the column of hot air, the stronger the pull it exerted on fresh air at the base. This was why Nils had insisted on a 14-foot flue rather than the standard 8 feet that most homesteaders installed. The additional height created roughly double the draft pressure, measured not in abstract units but in the visible difference of how flames leaned toward the flue opening and how quickly smoke vanished up the pipe. When draft was strong, combustion was complete. When draft was weak, combustion faltered and began producing the spent fire air that accumulated at floor level first, then rose slowly to fill the entire cabin over the course of hours. The danger intensified at night when families banked their fires to conserve wood and extend heat through the dark hours. Banking meant covering hot coals with ash and closing the damper to restrict airflow, allowing the fire to smolder rather than flame. This was standard practice across every homestead in Minnesota Territory, recommended by stove merchants and passed down through frontier wisdom as the efficient way to manage heat. But smoldering combustion was incomplete combustion by definition. It produced far more spent fire air per pound of wood than a hot, clean-burning flame. And when that spent fire air had nowhere to go because the damper was closed and the cabin was sealed tight against the cold, it simply accumulated in the living space where people slept. The concentration required to cause harm was measured in parts per million, a term Nils would never have known but a reality he understood through observation and outcome. At 400 parts per million, a person might experience headache and dizziness after several hours. At 800 parts per million, unconsciousness arrived within 2 to 3 hours, often during deep sleep when the body's warning systems were least responsive. At 1600 parts per million, death could occur in less than an hour. These numbers existed in medical literature published in eastern cities, but they meant nothing to homesteaders who had no way to measure invisible gas and relied instead on the false comfort of a warm cabin and a glowing stove. The conventional wisdom that governed frontier heating was built on assumptions that seemed reasonable until tested against reality. Tight chinking conserved heat and reduced wood consumption, therefore it was good. Closing the damper overnight extended the fire and saved labor, therefore it was efficient. A warm interior meant successful shelter, therefore the family was safe. These beliefs were reinforced by the fact that most nights, most families did wake up alive. The deaths were rare enough to be dismissed as accidents or attributed to weak constitution, bad luck, or improper stove operation rather than flawed methodology embedded in the system itself. When Nils tried to explain the danger at a settlement meeting in late January, he was met with the kind of skepticism reserved for theories that contradicted lived experience. John Peterson, who had survived 5 Minnesota winters in a tightly sealed cabin, asked why his family was still alive if the practice was so dangerous. Hendricks pointed out that stove gas deaths, while tragic, numbered only 1 or 2 per county per winter, hardly an epidemic that justified changing methods that worked for the vast majority of settlers. A stove merchant from Mankato argued that modern cast-iron heating systems were engineered for safety and that problems arose only when users failed to follow manufacturer instructions or purchased inferior products from competitors. The resistance was not rooted in stupidity but in the reasonable observation that most people survived most winters using methods that Nils claimed were deadly. What they could not see was the margin between survival and death, a margin measured in the specific combination of cabin size, flue height, damper position, outside temperature, and hours of exposure that determined whether spent fire air accumulated to lethal concentrations or remained below the threshold of harm. A cabin with a 10-foot flue and a partially open damper might produce 400 parts per million overnight, enough to cause headaches but not death. A cabin with an 8-foot flue and a fully closed damper might reach 800 parts per million in a smaller space, crossing into unconsciousness and beyond. The Scandinavian and indigenous building traditions that informed Nils's approach had solved this problem not through scientific measurement but through accumulated observation of what worked. Tall flues and permanent ventilation openings appeared in Norwegian winter houses because builders had learned that fire needed to breathe or it turned against the household. Native lodges incorporated smoke holes positioned to create draw and intake vents that pulled fresh air continuously through the living space, managing heat and airflow as inseparable elements of shelter design. These were not primitive solutions waiting to be replaced by modern efficiency but refined systems that balanced warmth with the atmospheric requirements of combustion. By the end of January, the temperature had dropped to 40 below during a week-long cold snap that tested every heating system in the territory. Families loaded their stoves with wood until the metal glowed red, then sealed every crack and closed every damper to trap heat against the brutal cold outside. The conventional wisdom held that survival meant maximum insulation and minimum heat loss. In Nils Bergstrom's cabin, the interior temperature settled at 55 degrees with the floor vent open and the damper 2/3 closed, cool enough to require heavy blankets but warm enough to prevent frostbite. His family woke each morning clear-headed and breathing easy while 3 more cabins in the surrounding townships fell silent, their occupants discovered days later when neighbors noticed that no smoke rose from chimneys that should have been burning constantly. The winter of 1887 to 1888 entered the historical record as one of the coldest in Minnesota Territory's documented history, with temperatures remaining below 20 below zero for 11 consecutive days in late January and early February. The cold arrived without the dramatic warning of blizzard winds or heavy snowfall, settling instead as a clear, crystalline stillness that turned breath to ice crystals and made the sound of axe strikes carry for miles across frozen prairie. Families retreated into their cabins and fed their stoves around the clock, burning through wood supplies that were meant to last until March. The smoke from dozens of chimneys rose vertically in the windless air, visible for hours after sunrise, then disappeared as night came early and temperatures dropped further. The first discovery came on February 3 when a neighbor noticed that the Jensen cabin, located 2 miles south of Marshall, had shown no smoke for 2 full days despite temperatures holding at 30 below. When he forced open the door, he found the family of 4 still in their beds, faces relaxed in expressions that suggested sleep rather than distress. The cabin interior was cold but not frozen. The stove held ash that was no longer warm but showed evidence of a fire that had burned through the night. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that anyone had attempted to escape or seek help. The coroner's report listed stove gas as the cause, noting that the flue measured 7 feet in total height and the damper had been found in the fully closed position. Within a week, 3 more cabins had been discovered in similar condition. The Olson family northeast of town. The Carlsons near the township line. A widow and her 2 children in a claim shanty that had been built just 4 months earlier with careful attention to tight chinking and efficient heat retention. Each inquest revealed the same pattern: warm stoves, sealed cabins, no fire damage, and families found deceased without evidence of suffering. The phrase that appeared in every official record was becoming impossible to dismiss as isolated accident or user error. Thomas Hendricks, who had presided over inquests for 6 years without encountering more than 1 stove gas death per winter, now found himself recording 4 in 8 days. The community response shifted from skepticism to fear, though the fear manifested as confusion rather than panic. If the stoves were warm and the cabins were sealed against the cold, what had actually killed these families? Some argued it was weak lungs or pre-existing illness that the cold had merely exposed. Others suggested that cheap coal or green wood had produced dangerous smoke that proper fuel would have avoided. The stove merchant from Mankato insisted that his products were safe when operated according to instructions and implied that the deaths resulted from improper fire management rather than flawed heating systems. What no one wanted to acknowledge was that the victims had done everything conventional wisdom recommended. They had built tight cabins, installed modern stoves, closed their dampers at night, and trusted in methods that everyone agreed were correct. The mortality pattern revealed something that statistical analysis would have made obvious but that frontier experience obscured: deaths clustered in newly built cabins constructed during the previous 2 years. These were structures built with careful attention to the latest homesteading advice, featuring improved chinking techniques and tighter construction than the earlier generation of claim shanties. The builders had succeeded in creating cabins that retained heat far more efficiently than their predecessors, but efficiency in heat retention meant efficiency in trapping spent fire air as well. The older, drafty cabins that leaked cold air through gaps in the walls and floors had provided unintentional ventilation that prevented lethal accumulation. The newer, better-sealed cabins had eliminated that safety margin and replaced it with a deadly efficiency that no one had anticipated. By mid-February, the count stood at 7 confirmed deaths with stove gas listed as the cause, and rumors suggested several more in outlying townships that had not yet been officially investigated. The conventional practice of sealing tight and closing dampers had not changed because the alternative seemed obviously worse. Opening vents and wasting heat during the coldest winter in memory appeared suicidal when measured against the relatively rare occurrence of stove gas deaths. Most families continued to wake up alive each morning, which reinforced the belief that the problem was exceptional rather than systematic. The deaths were tragedies, certainly, but tragedies that happened to other people whose specific circumstances must have differed in some crucial but unidentified way. Nils Bergstrom's cabin stood as a quiet counterpoint to the failure unfolding across the territory. His family continued to wake each morning with the same clear-headed alertness they had shown all winter, despite living in a structure that violated every principle of efficient heat conservation that frontier wisdom endorsed. The interior temperature rarely rose above 60 degrees even during the coldest nights, cold enough that heavy wool blankets were necessary and breath sometimes frosted in the air near the floor vent. His firewood consumption was actually higher than his neighbors during the early weeks of extreme cold, burning through nearly 2 cords in January alone. But the family showed none of the symptoms that had appeared in other households before deaths occurred: no persistent headaches, no morning dizziness, no unexplained fatigue that made simple tasks feel exhausting. The difference became impossible to ignore when Anna Peterson arrived at Nils's door on February 19. Her husband had died 6 days earlier in circumstances identical to the other stove gas deaths, and she had been advised by well-meaning neighbors to seal her cabin even tighter to protect her 2 children from the cold that everyone assumed was the real danger. Instead, she had knocked on the door of the Norwegian carpenter whose methods everyone had called wasteful and asked him what he knew that her dead husband had not. Nils walked her through the modifications in language stripped of theory: extend the flue to at least 14 feet using salvaged stovepipe if new sections were too expensive, cut a 2-inch gap in a floorboard positioned away from sleeping areas, and never close the damper more than 2/3 even during the coldest nights. The changes took 3 hours to implement using materials that cost less than $2. Anna Peterson survived the remainder of that winter in the same cabin where her husband had died, waking each morning to temperatures in the low 50s and air that felt thin and cold but allowed her to think clearly and move without the creeping fatigue that she now recognized had been building in the weeks before her husband's death. Her survival became a reference point whispered through settlement networks, not as dramatic proof but as quiet evidence that something in Nils's approach addressed a danger that conventional methods had failed to prevent. By the end of February, 2 other families had made similar modifications, extending their flues and cutting floor vents despite the certain increase in firewood consumption and the social cost of admitting that the accepted practice might be wrong. The shift from mockery to instruction began not with formal acknowledgement but with quiet visits that arrived after dark when neighbors could seek advice without admitting publicly that their methods had failed. Nils Bergstrom found himself answering questions that a month earlier would have earned dismissive laughter, questions about flue height, damper position, and the counterintuitive practice of allowing cold air to enter a cabin during sub-zero nights. The requests came from men who had built their own homes and considered themselves competent in frontier construction, men who now faced the recognition that competence in one domain did not guarantee understanding in another. The modifications Nils helped implement were neither complex nor expensive, which made their effectiveness all the more striking. The first priority was always flue height. Most homestead cabins featured stovepipes that ran horizontally through the nearest wall, then turned upward for 6 to 8 feet of exterior chimney. Nils showed settlers how to add salvaged pipe sections to reach 14 to 18 feet total height, bracing the extended flue with wire guys anchored to the cabin roof or nearby posts. The additional height cost between 75 cents and $1.50 in materials when new pipe was required, but most families scrounged discarded sections from abandoned claims or purchased used pipe from the stove merchant in town. The difference in draft was immediately perceptible. Flames that had previously flickered and smoked now burned clean and drew hard toward the flue opening. The second modification addressed makeup air. Nils instructed families to cut a controlled opening near the floor, typically by planing down one floorboard to create a gap of 1 to 2 inches running several feet along the wall opposite the stove. The positioning mattered because intake air needed to flow across the floor toward the stove without creating a direct draft on sleeping areas. Some families worried that the gap would allow vermin entry or create unbearable cold spots, but Nils showed them how to cover the opening with coarse wire mesh that permitted airflow while blocking mice and how to position furniture to deflect the cold air stream before it reached beds. The modification took less than an hour and required no materials beyond a hand plane and a scrap of wire mesh. The third and most psychologically difficult change involved damper management. Frontier practice dictated closing the damper at night to bank the fire and conserve wood, but Nils insisted that the damper remain at least 1/3 open at all times and preferably 2/3 open during sleeping hours. This meant accepting higher wood consumption and cooler interior temperatures, trading efficiency for safety in a calculation that felt wasteful to families who measured prosperity in cords of wood and degrees of warmth. The resistance was strongest among those who had survived multiple winters using closed dampers and saw no reason to change a practice that had kept them alive thus far. Thomas Hendricks was among the first to implement the full set of modifications, driven not by personal fear but by the accumulating evidence in his coroner's records. He extended his flue to 16 feet using new pipe sections purchased in town, cut a 1-inch floor gap along his north wall, and forced himself to leave the damper half open during the night despite the immediate drop in interior temperature from 65 degrees to 52. His firewood consumption increased by roughly 15% during the first week, then stabilized at approximately 10% above his previous usage as he learned to manage the more open system. The cold was undeniable but bearable, requiring an additional blanket and acceptance that winter comfort meant something different than summer ease. What Hendricks noticed over the following weeks was the absence of symptoms he had not previously recognized as dangerous. The persistent morning headache that he had attributed to aging disappeared. The afternoon fatigue that had made simple tasks feel exhausting lifted. His wife reported sleeping more soundly and waking more alert, changes that seemed minor until measured against the fogginess that had characterized previous winters. The family burned more wood but required less effort to maintain daily routines, a trade that made economic sense only when the alternative was unconsciousness and death. By early March, 11 families within a 10-mile radius of Marshall had made similar modifications. The results formed a pattern that even skeptics could not entirely dismiss: 0 stove gas incidents among retrofitted cabins during the remainder of the winter, compared to 2 additional deaths in sealed cabins during late February cold snaps. The sample size was small enough that coincidence remained a possible explanation, but the directional evidence was clear. Families who implemented the modifications experienced no deaths, persistent illness, or morning symptoms that had previously been accepted as normal winter discomfort. The stove merchant from Mankato gradually adjusted his recommendations as customer reports accumulated. He began suggesting flue extensions as standard practice rather than optional upgrade, emphasizing that taller chimneys improved draft and reduced maintenance issues even if customers did not accept the stove gas theory. He quietly stopped recommending overnight damper closure and instead advised partial restriction that maintained continuous flow. His shift was pragmatic rather than ideological. He sold more pipe sections with the new recommendations and faced fewer complaints about stove performance from customers whose systems now drew properly. The local newspaper editor, a man named Samuel Clark who had compiled mortality statistics for 6 years, published a brief notice in the March 15 edition advising readers to consider flue height and ventilation modifications based on the winter's death patterns. The language was careful and avoided direct criticism of conventional practice, but the core message was unmistakable: sealed cabins with short flues had produced fatalities while ventilated cabins with tall flues had not. Clark included no dramatic claims about revolutionary discoveries or vindication of marginalized knowledge, only a straightforward presentation of observed outcomes that readers could interpret according to their own judgment. The vindication that Niels Bergstrom experienced was not the public acknowledgement that narratives often require but rather the quiet adoption of methods that saved lives without requiring anyone to admit they had been wrong. Families implemented the modifications because they worked, not because they understood the physics of combustion or accepted that their previous practices had been deadly. The distinction mattered less than the outcome. By the time spring arrived and the last fires burned down to ash, the cabins that had been retrofitted according to Nils's instructions had maintained a perfect survival record, while conventional practice had claimed 7 documented lives and likely several more in outlying areas where deaths went unreported or were attributed to other causes. The lessons that emerged from the winter of 1887 to 1888 did not remain confined to Marshall, Minnesota, or even to the immediate territories where stove gas deaths had concentrated. Samuel Clark's newspaper notice was reprinted in regional papers throughout the upper Midwest during the spring of 1888, often with local editors adding their own observations about ventilation failures and winter mortality patterns. The language remained cautious and avoided sensationalism, but the core information spread through the informal networks that connected frontier communities, notices posted in general stores, conversations at grain elevators, advice shared between families during spring planting season when neighbors gathered to exchange seed and equipment. By the 1890s, public health notices began formalizing what practical experience had already taught. County officials in Minnesota and the Dakotas issued guidelines recommending minimum flue heights of 14 feet for residential heating systems, permanent ventilation opening size to cabin volume, and warnings against full damper closure during sleeping hours. The recommendations were framed as fire safety measures rather than acknowledgments of systematic failure, which allowed for adoption without requiring institutions to admit that previous guidance had contributed to preventable deaths. The distinction between diplomatic language and technical accuracy mattered less than the outcome. Building practices changed in ways that reduced mortality even as the official narrative avoided direct criticism of what had come before. The stove manufacturing industry responded with design modifications that addressed ventilation concerns without explicitly acknowledging that earlier products had been implicated in deaths. New models featured dampers that could not close completely, maintaining a minimum opening even when adjusted to the most restrictive position. Flue collars were redesigned to encourage vertical rather than horizontal pipe runs, and installation instructions began emphasizing the relationship between proper draft and safe operation. Manufacturers marketed these changes as improvements in efficiency and convenience rather than safety corrections, but the effect was the same. Heating systems sold after 1890 incorporated principles that Niels Bergstrom had insisted upon 2 decades earlier. The validation of traditional knowledge came not through formal recognition but through quiet incorporation into accepted practice. The Scandinavian building techniques that had informed Niels's approach became standard recommendations without attribution or acknowledgement that they represented anything other than common sense. The indigenous ventilation principles that had managed smoke and airflow in lodges for generations appeared in settler construction guides as original innovations discovered through frontier experience. The erasure was complete and unremarkable, following the pattern that characterized most knowledge transfer on the American frontier. Techniques that worked were adopted and attributed to practical American ingenuity while their origins in older traditions were forgotten or ignored. What remained in the historical record were the mortality statistics that showed a clear decline in stove gas deaths after 1890, dropping from an average of 1 to 2 deaths per county per winter to near zero in regions where ventilation guidelines had been widely adopted. The reduction was gradual rather than dramatic, spread across enough years that no single intervention could claim credit, but the directional change was unmistakable when examined over decades. Families still died from cold exposure, fire, and the countless other hazards that characterized frontier life, but they stopped dying in their sleep from the invisible accumulation of spent fire air in sealed cabins with inadequate draft. The scientific understanding that eventually explained these outcomes developed independently of frontier experience and arrived decades after practical solutions had already been implemented. Carbon monoxide was identified and studied by researchers in urban settings during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, characterized as a colorless, odorless gas produced by incomplete combustion that bonded with hemoglobin more readily than oxygen itself. The concentration measurements that defined lethal exposure, 70 parts per million triggering modern alarm systems, 800 parts per million causing unconsciousness within hours, formalized what builders like Niels Bergstrom had understood through observation: fire needed to burn completely or it produced poison, and complete combustion required adequate draft and makeup air. Modern building codes incorporated these principles as foundational requirements rather than optional improvements. Minimum flue heights were specified in feet and inches with adjustments for building height and heating capacity. Combustion air requirements were calculated based on BTU output and space volume. Carbon monoxide detectors became mandatory safety devices that alarmed at concentrations far below lethal levels, providing warning that 19th-century settlers had lacked. The regulations represented the codification of knowledge that had been purchased through death and refined through desperate adaptation, transformed into requirements so fundamental that contemporary builders rarely questioned why they existed. The irony that would have been apparent to anyone who survived the winter of 1888 was how completely modern society had forgotten that these lessons had ever needed learning. Carbon monoxide poisoning was treated as a rare accident caused by equipment failure or user error rather than a systematic danger embedded in the relationship between fire, oxygen, and enclosed space. The assumption that modern heating systems were inherently safe obscured the fact that safety came not from technology itself but from the ventilation principles that traditional builders had understood generations before scientific explanation caught up with practical necessity. What Niels Bergstrom had known through inherited wisdom and direct observation, that fire was a process requiring continuous exchange with the atmosphere, that warmth achieved through sealing was warmth that could kill, that efficiency measured in heat retention alone was efficiency that ignored the fundamental requirements of combustion, became the foundation of building science without anyone remembering that it had once been controversial frontier knowledge dismissed as wasteful superstition. The families who survived because of his insistence on tall flues and floor vents left no dramatic testimonials or public acknowledgments. They simply lived through winters that killed their neighbors, raised children in cabins that stayed breathable, and passed along advice that gradually became so obvious that its origins were forgotten. The frontier did not kill people with cold alone, though cold received the blame in popular memory and historical narrative. It killed them when they mistook sealed warmth for safety, when they trusted iron stoves to manage themselves without understanding the invisible requirements of the fire inside, and when they dismissed older knowledge as primitive simply because it came from traditions that predated American settlement. The lesson was relearned at a cost measured in families found still in their beds, faces relaxed in sleep that became death because no one had taught them that fire, like land, must be allowed to breathe or it turns against those who depend upon it.